Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Welcome to another BritFlix.com podcast. My name's Stuart Wright, and today's guest is an assistant professor at Northumbria University in the Northumbria School of Design, Arts and Creative Industries. He is a film scholar and a leading authority on extreme imagery and the intersections between horror and pornography. His early publications established his reputation by interrogating extreme imagery, particularly horror films that include explicit sex and sexual violence, and pornographic films that draw on horror tropes and conventions. His first book, Torture Porn, Popular Horror Films After Saw 2013, is the cornerstone of that body of work. His second book, The Metamodern Slasher Film, was published late last year and is what we'll be talking about today, as well as 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Steve Jones.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely my pleasure. Now, before we get into the book, I have to ask, can you explain what if this is not too big an ask, because obviously it's a big part of your biography, can you explain what you observed or wrote about with regards to extreme imagery that made you a leading authority, in so much as what gap did you fill or new thinking did you start to evolve?
So, some of this might come out when we start talking about my favourite films anyway. But it's just kind of, I found that I was talking about horror, and at the time when I was writing my thesis was around the time when the government started talking about the Dangerous Pictures Bill. Okay. And so there were some films that I was looking at for my thesis that, because I finished my thesis just as the law was coming into action. And I had to make a decision whether to take some of the films out of my thesis because they were going to be potentially illegal, because I didn't know what the law was going to be. Wow. And it'd be a public declaration that I'd seen those films. And so then I started to get invited to, because I had to lose 36,000 words of my thesis almost overnight. I just made the decision because, it was better to do that. Yeah. Than to risk it and rewrite. And so I then started to get invited to talk about that process itself and the ethics of it and what it meant for me as a researcher. And then I got invited to do more publications based on some of that imagery. And I just gained this reputation as the person who was willing to look at all that nasty stuff, that because no one really talks about it, because a lot of it's either the pornography is really taboo and, porn studies is a thing, but it was still fairly early on when I was doing my thesis. Yeah. And a lot of people who weren't really looking at that kind of horror because people tend to focus on mainstream cinematic horror. So let alone indie films, let alone the really nasty films that haven't really got legitimate any kind of distribution. Yeah. So that's what I got a reputation for doing. Okay. You don't choose your research specialism. I found out quite early it chooses you.
Indeed. It was like a big finger pointed at you.
Yeah. Or as I heard someone on YouTube once who was reading one of my papers live on a stream who said, and their commenters said, I should be on a register. That was which I don't think I should be. But that's what I ended up being.
Well, look, wandering into safer horror territory then, let's give the audience then a brief synopsis of what the book Metamodern Slasher Film is. before we get going into looking at what it is about?
Sure. So the basic argument of the book is that there's this reputation that slasher films have from the early 2000s onwards, that they were just remakes and there's nothing else really going on in the subgenre. And that didn't fit very well with my experience as someone who loves the subgenre, has seen a lot of it. That just, when I thought about what I'd seen from the early 2000s forwards, post the torture porn bubble, the kinds of films I was seeing, it just didn't strike me as being true. Sure, there's a few slasher film remakes knocking around, but there's also all this other stuff happening. And so I started watching a lot of that and trying to pin down what it was that made it feel very different to the slasher films that had come before, especially the postmodern slasher films like Scream and so forth. And that's where I found metamodernism to be a good way of articulating what had changed and what these films were doing instead compared with their predecessors.
Now, I must confess that metamodernism is a new word to me. Having read some of your book, it's not a new word, but it is a new word for me. And I imagine it'll be for a few of our listeners. So is there any way to, I know you spend time in the book unpacking it, but is there a simple way to unpack the word metamodern in terms of what it means, I guess, in direct relation to postmodern, I suppose? Yeah.
So for me, like, the way I'm using it is to try and capture a tone, or as the people who originally coined the term said, a sensibility. So in the zeitgeist. The easy way of putting it is, and this is crass, so bear with me, is that the postmodern period had this kind of tone of sort of snarky cynicism and apathy. Like, there was no progress, there was no hope of us getting anywhere. It's all, so we may as well just play a game and know that we're playing a game, but we need to have a kind of apathy about the idea of innovation and progress because we're not going anywhere, and everyone is just limited to their own sphere of experience, will never find the truth, this kind of thing. The metamodern period for me it has a tone of much greater earnestness and sincerity. Like, we still recognize that all that is the case and irony is still a thing now, but there are things that we genuinely care about and emotionally respond to, and that's where the shift comes for me. There's a tonal shift. The way I like to capture it in a neat way is that when you think about meme culture, when people post memes about like Trump being horrible or whatever, then they're making these sort of ironic jokes about what's happening. But there's that one with the dog in the room on fire and it's saying that everything's fine, right? And people post that and they're making a joke about what's happening, but it's not in that kind of snarky, therefore throw your hands up in the air, give up, who cares sort of way of thinking that was characteristic of the postmodern tone. Now it's much more like, I genuinely care about this and I'm upset about it, but I don't know what to do about it, but I hope something can be done about it. That's the subtle shift in tone. And I think that's what we're getting reflected in these slasher films, is that there's something about them that's much more alive to the idea that we can progress forward, or that we hope we can, or that we hope we can do something about the crises that we're facing, be it environmental crises or economic crises or political crises, which are worse than they ever have been, or feel like they're worse than they ever have been, but that people genuinely care about them. That's the kind of tonal shift that I'm trying to get to.
It made me think, because when I put like sincerity and cynicism next to each other, like, it reminds me of a sort of almost like the anti-tech response that we had, that people called the search for authenticity in the early noughties. It reminds me of that, like people going back to knitting circles and what kind of, whether I guess it plays into that. I can just take agency, and I suppose playing with the slasher genre, you begin to sort of shape it into something that offers something more hopeful than just a list of people getting killed. I mean, it kind of is.
I mean, that's one of the things that interested me about like the putting the two things together, because it doesn't feel like, of all the things in the world, the slasher film where you have young people being cut down in their prime doesn't feel like the most optimal place to have these sort of sincere expressions of bonding between people or hope for the future. Nevertheless, that's what I found in these films and thought and that's unusual enough that it warranted writing about.
A question I often ask documentarians when they finish the documentary is about the perceptions they had going into the documentary and then the change of their perception after they've done the documentary. And obviously when you've picked a subject that you love and you're already interested in, and then you write a book about it where you explore it to a level of detail you wouldn't necessarily do when you just rationalise it as a film fan. What fun discoveries did you make or observations did you make that you couldn't have done before you wrote the book?
There are several.
Mm-hmm.
One is that there were some films that when I went to write the book, I started rewatching as many contemporary slasher films as I could.
Right.
And it was nice to go back to some of the ones that I'd written off actually quite early on. Like Shrooms, for instance, I really didn't like the first time I saw it.
Okay.
And I just wrote it off as a film and just went, I'm quite... I'm not a great fan of hard drugs, so it was just like it just seemed like a pro drugs film to me, like because I wasn't watching it properly.
Yeah.
It isn't in retrospect, but that's the way I'd written it off at the time, and I think the marketing didn't help it in that sense. But when I came back to it, I thought this is actually a really interesting film. There's loads going on here. I'm really glad that I've just come back to watch it, if nothing else, let alone find something interesting to say about it. And that happened to me with a number of films that ended up in the book. And there was also, I was really pleased that I got a chance to find a number of indie films that I otherwise wouldn't have seen because I was just watching as widely as possible. So like Axe Murdering with Hackley, I'll never stop singing the praises of because I really like it as a movie. And I never would have discovered it. Even though I watch a lot of slasher films, I never would have discovered it without having the impetus to go and research it. So
I am so glad I've read your book because I didn't know that film either. And that's one of the films I'm going to be hunting out.
Yeah, I mean, this is where like something like Amazon Prime is really good because a lot of they buy a lot of independent film, and so a lot of the things that I'm searching for I found on there. I was just like, oh great, this is brilliant, and so I sort of started trawling through their lists of slasher films and seeing all sorts of films that I wouldn't have done otherwise. And I think it's really expanded my understanding of what was happening in the subgenre. I knew there's more happening than just remakes, but I didn't really get a sense of the breadth of what was happening until after I'd finished the research.
Yeah, no, and then in terms of, so what other gems did you find for yourself then? You've mentioned some there, but what other gems have you sort of either reacquainted yourself with or discovered for the first time?
Now this is difficult with this book because I submitted it about 2.5 years ago.
Okay.
I've just about finished the second book, which is related to this one, which is also about a slasher film. So I've got those in my mind at the moment. So I found a lot of films made from the 90s forwards that I didn't know about across the period, the last 7 years that I've been researching. Some of them that I'm really glad I saw. There's a Spanish film called Tuna Negro, which is the Black Serenade, which is great, which I think I would have, again, written off as just being a kind of Scream knockoff. But there's a lot going on in it that's really worthwhile. There's a film called Getting Schooled, which was made in 2017, that I don't think that I would have watched in the same way without the having to do the research and putting it into a context. It was, again, I won't spoil it, but it's well worth checking out because of what it does with the characters and the characterization. I was really pleased to get a chance to go back to Triangle and write about that because I've always loved it. It's one of my top 10 films, I think. It's
in my top 5 horror films.
I love it so much.
I'm with you completely.
And I really, really was glad to get a chat because I've always been looking for an excuse to write about that, and I found it. Detention as well is phenomenal, and I remember thinking it was phenomenal at the time and wanting to write about it. The sort of the linchpin of the Metamodern book for me was this film that, again, I loved the first time I saw it, and I was glad I got a chance to write about it, was I Didn't Come Here to Die, which again is one of those sort of indie productions that I found in the sort of the equivalent of the Amazon Prime bubble when I was getting films from Love Film, and every horror film was just get sent to me, and that was one of them. And again, it's what it's doing with the subgenre is really interesting, and I'm really glad that I got a chance to write about that too.
Well, I'm glad. I mean, you reference it in the book, but I was reading about that and then thinking, but that's bodies, isn't it? And then you go, it's taken wholesale. It's interesting that there's no reference to the Didn't Come Here to Die that I can find anywhere in terms of the way people have written about bodies. And I've read the original screenplay for Bodies, and it has a killer. So something changed in the development of the film to turn it into something more like I Didn't Come Here to Die, which is interesting in of itself.
Yeah. There's and I can't remember the title of it now, that I was presenting somewhere and they used it as an example, and another filmmaker said, "Oh, have you seen this film?" I can't remember what it is now. And it was doing practically the same thing, but it was like around the same time, as well as maybe a year after I Didn't Come Here to Die. So there's something clearly happening in the zeitgeist around that time that made people think.
I suppose you should say that for those that don't know them, and this is a bit of a spoiler, but they are what you would call a slasher-less slasher. Yeah,
absolutely. So
which is such a great. And I think thinking about bodies, and then I Didn't Come Here to Die. I haven't read about it. That's when I began to understand what you meant by your sort of metamodern, like what was happening. Because in a way, you can. I mean, I've not seen Didn't Come Here to Die, but if I look at bodies, you can read that as a drama about and paranoia about a bunch of hedonistic 20-somethings who you could argue have just grown apart, which is a very universal truth, and they don't know how to be apart, and their ill feelings for each other just come out in really bizarre ways in that kind of boiler room situation that they think is a killer is out to get them.
Yeah. And you can see how it's like progressing forwards from something like Scream, where everyone's a suspect and there's the sort of paranoia, and that seems to be that it's now embedded in their friendship circle in Bodies, and they just begin from that premise and work forward from it in a way that Scream, the most recent Scream films, are still just digging down into the same thing, whereas Bodies is doing something moving forward with it, which is why it's metamodern, not postmodern for me.
Now, a couple of friends of mine who I know through Fright Fest have written a book that's going to be coming out soon called Alone in the Dark, A Century of Stalk and Slash. So knowing I was speaking to you, I asked them for why they love slasher films so much. If I can, I'll just read you what they said, and then I'll put that question to you. So Phil Morrison, who's one of the co-authors of Alone in the Dark, said, "For me, the genre is like a big old duvet. It's comfort food, remembering the time growing up and watching these films underage, if you will, at a time where these films were hard to track down. Are we going to see some excellent gore effects? Are we going to see some awesome kills? Is there going to be gratuitous nudity? And in some cases, play the amateur sleuth with the unmasking of the killer when there is a whodunit element. And to a certain degree, that hasn't changed in all the years later. The linear thread of the slasher hasn't really changed. It's just the way filmmakers come up with new and, in some cases, ways to deliver the excitement. And we both get revved up at the prospect of any new slasher movie. Good or mostly bad, it really is in our DNA." And then Haydn Watkins, the other co-author, said, "A lot of it's nostalgia for me, watching Halloween and Friday the 13th on TV or VHS and then discovering The Burning, My Bloody Valentine a bit later. I also love how down-to-earth the slasher film is. Having a real flesh-and-blood killer stalking kids on a campus or in the woods somehow made it scarier for me. The gore and the nudity also had a lasting impact on my life." And then in a kind of postmodern thing, he gives me a laughing, crying emoji at the end of that. So if I can, I think this is where, just for the listeners' benefit, I did a balls up on the recording, but I think this gets us back to again. If you can step back from academic Dr. Steve Jones, what do you enjoy about slasher films as Steve Jones, the film fan?
Sure. I mean, I think that some of it chimes in with those two responses, but for me, I suppose I like how almost limited the subgenre is, like the formula of the subgenre is, that it's very, some people write it off as being like simplistic and one-dimensional. I see it as being distilled and robust. Mm-hmm. And in the same way that you get like Sam Raimi saying that when he made The Evil Dead, the limitations force you to be creative, and that's what was, and then you end up with this wild thing at the end of it. That's kind of what what I like about the slasher film is that at its best, the limitations of the formula mean that there's always opportunity for surprise and something new, because it doesn't take much to just add a little bit in or tweak a little bit here, and suddenly you've got something unexpected because the formula is so it's so like straightforward is the way I would put it. Rather than simple, it's straightforward, and that means that you've got opportunities to do something within those limitations. That's the thing that I find constantly surprises me about it, that there's always something unusual, even in the most stock iterations of the subgenre. There's always something that comes out, and I think it probably says a lot about the filmmakers' personalities as well, that there's something that comes through to me from them.
Now, obviously the book is well researched and evidenced, and is therefore an attempt at an objective view. But obviously, it's still going to be there's still going to be some subjectivity in there. And I did like the caveat that you added into your, I think it's introduction, or where you say one's own idiosyncratic engagement with the subgenre is distinctively valuable. Why did you say that? What is that about? What are you speaking for there in terms of what you're covering in the book, or just in terms of gauging in films full stop?
I think one of the things that came out of the research when I was looking at what the films are doing is that they prioritize subjective perspectives. They prioritize the emotional reality of the characters as being worth listening to, or like worth expressing. And so that's what led me to think about my own subjective responses to the subgenre. I thought it would be silly for me not to acknowledge that that's part of what's happening here with my engagement with these films, when the films are prioritizing that so much. So it kind of ended up reflecting back at me that obviously there's only a certain number of films that I've seen, because I can't have seen everything.
Of course.
And the films that I have seen shape the way I respond to the films that I'm going to see. So that I can't escape my subjective perspective on the subgenre. I can't help but to have a knock-on effect of how I respond to the films that I'm engaging with.
Yeah. You're going to find this a crass comparison, but I went to see a Bob Dylan exhibition in Seattle years ago, and there's a little bit of interview with him, and the interviewer says, "Hey, Bob, how can I write a song like you?" And Bob says, "Well, you're going to have to read all the books I've read, listen to all the music I've read in the same order, and then you might have a chance."
Absolutely. It ends up being that, but I think that's part of that sort of journey that you go on, is part of what these films are talking about. And so it ended up being part of what I had to do to engage with them.
And what's interesting, as you release the book, and almost like a throwback to 50 years ago, when the genre was popular but nobody wanted to write about it, is Terrifier 3 suddenly beating Joker 2 at the box office. So proving once again that the dead slasher subgenre is very much alive and well, and audiences. And I think, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you talk about this idea of what, if people haven't experienced it before, then they're kind of seeing it you've got an audience now seeing it for the first time. And I've been, as someone that grew up through, was old enough to have grown up through the Video Nasty era and Carolyn Glover's book and the idea of the male gaze and everything, the idea that something like Terrifier 3 would excite female genre fans blows my mind. But I'm seeing it amongst people who blog and podcast about it, that it's very popular. And I can't get my head around it, because in terms of your metamodern thesis in your book, it strikes me that Terrifier 3 is a tad regressive in some senses.
Right. I mean, I think because I mentioned Terrifier in the final chapter of it, because this was before it kind of exploded as one of those. No,
of course, no, you can't
potential new icons. But it's become clear to me because of this year I taught a horror module, and a lot of my students were talking about Terrifier because it was big at the time when I was teaching it.
Yeah.
And it became my suspicions that Art the Clown was going to be the new Freddy Krueger were just like, it just became apparent that that's what it is. But it's this, like, for those students and younger, it's very clear that that's their new Freddy Krueger, and it feels very much like the same kind of sort of cultural presence. And so I can see why people are really attracted to it in those kind of ways, in the same way that in the 80s when people were talking about Freddy, there was a lot of like fans being interviewed saying Freddy was sexy and that kind of thing, which I never understood in the slightest, but I can see that it's charismatic in the same way that Art the Clown is, and I can see why it's capturing the imagination of people in the same way.
No, it just struck me that I've only seen 1 and 2, I've not seen 3, so maybe 3 is some sort of big leap into the 21st century. But it just struck me that in terms of all the progress I'd seen, in terms of this idea of, I guess, where we are, the zeitgeist and whatever that shapes the movie. It's not necessarily about, like you say in the book, it's not like one film released in this age this year will be on the path to being that thing later on. I just wonder. It just makes me wonder what the Terrifier series is a response to. And certainly, I guess, like you say, if it's just simply he's our hero to hold on to, because you can reboot Halloween and Nightmare all you want, but it still won't. It still will be a 90s or an 80s phenomenon.
Yeah. I'm not exactly sure what. I think I'd like to see where the next Terrifier film goes with it, because I think the thing for me about Terrifier 3 is that, and 2 to some extent, is they seem to be backpedaling away from Art the Clown himself. He seems to be less central to the films than he was in the first instance, and I personally think that's a mistake. But it's clearly going somewhere, and they have an idea of where the character's supposed to be going, and maybe we'll get more answers as to what the character's supposed to be and why it's chiming with the moment once we've seen the story complete. But it's hard to grip him at the moment, I think, because I'm not too sure what they're aiming for with him now.
Now, one last thing. When people are thinking about the slasher genre as a subgenre of horror, and you wrestle with what it is defined as in terms of how people have described it through the ages, as it were, and then you bring it together yourself into what you believe it is. And I'm not going to ask you to repeat that chapter, but in some senses, though, can you give me what your favourite definition is of the slasher film, like how it in terms of what people who are listening to this who don't know a slasher film from a torture porn film, what would you describe it as?
Okay, so a slasher film orients around a central killer who is a human or was a human, rather than being like a werewolf or another kind of monster. It's a distinct category of monster, much like the vampire film or the werewolf film or something, but the slasher film is oriented around a slasher killer. They tend to pick off a group of people within a defined location. So usually it's young people, but not always. Usually the killer picks them off one by one, not always, but usually. In the early 80s, the victims weren't very aware of what was happening to them until it was too late. So they were picked off in isolation. As we move into the 90s, they tend to be aware that there's a killer on the loose, but in the Scream era, they don't seem to care very much about each other. So they just get paranoid that one of them might be the killer. Those are the sort of the defining traits. The killer is quite obsessive. So they tend to either stalk a particular category of people, so young people or women or whatever the defining group might be that speaks to their agenda, or they kill on a particular calendar date, or they kill because someone encroaches on their territory, or this speaks to kind of an obsessiveness that's what they're there to do, is just to wipe out whoever comes within their remit. That's the main thing. Usually the killer's masked, or we don't know their identity because we see them from point of view, or they're mysterious because they're some kind of supernatural entity, and like Freddy Krueger, who's in our dreams, so we don't quite know who he is until we encounter him, and then it's too late. Those are sort of the main traits that really stand out to me that help to bring the subgenre together. But there are, like with any subgenre, there's always bleeding out in different directions. There are crossovers with sci-fi slashers and whatever, but those are the main things.
Brilliant. Well, look, the Metamodern Slasher Film book is out now. Can you tell people how they can get hold of it?
Yeah, sure. Though, so it's just about everywhere. It's now out in paperback, so it's actually affordable now. This is the perils of academic publishing. So you can get it on Amazon. You can get it through the Edinburgh University Press website. It's published with Edinburgh University Press, but it's basically everywhere. So as long as you can remember the word metamodern, you'll find it. The follow-up, the postmodern slasher, is out in June.
Blimey, you're quick off the mark.
It was originally one project.
Okay.
So it was like one massive book. No one would publish it because it was 250,000 words.
Okay,
so
okay.
It's two books, but basically the same project.
Fantastic. Well, look, that's exciting. Congratulations on the book. I mean, I've not finished it, but I'm certainly enjoying what I've read so far. And it just gives us to say, move on to 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life. Right then, moving into 3 films that have impacted everything in your adult life, Steve. You've given me 3 films, for which I'll give a little brief intro to, and then you will talk. We have got 5 minutes per film, and every time each film finishes the 5 minutes, we will hear this sound. You can hear that okay at your end?
Yeah, brilliant.
Steve's first choice is from 1984, and its box office success saved New Line Cinema from bankruptcy, gaining the production company nickname of The House That Freddy Built. It's the story of a teenage girl who must uncover the dark truth concealed by her parents after she and her friends become targets of the spirit of a serial killer with a bladed glove in their dreams, in which, if they die, it kills them in real life. I'm talking about Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. Do you want to tell us how that has an impact on you and why it has fond memories?
Great. It's my first proper horror film, but my obsession with Nightmare on Elm Street began. It's still my favourite film of all time. My obsession with Nightmare on Elm Street began long before that because, and I was a child of the 80s, so it was everywhere culturally. But my first encounter with the series was in 1986 in a video store when I was fascinated by box cover art anyway. And it was when the second film was released that Graham Humphrey's artwork was the poster for it was on the counter. And I was about as tall as me because I'm only 6 at the time. And it's just Freddy Krueger's face staring, well, my mum's renting something nice for me, staring me in the face above a burning school bus. And I'm like, who is Freddy? Why is he so angry? What the hell's going on? Why does he want to burn this bunch of kids up? Why is he taking revenge? Fascinated from that moment forwards. And I finally got to see it when I was about 8 or 9. And it was the first proper horror film I saw. I found it really, it didn't, in some ways, didn't live up to the anticipation because nothing could. Because when I was a kid, I was 6 and I was like, why do I have to be 18 to watch this? Why do I have to live my life? Like, why do I have to be 3 times older than I am now? It's like someone saying to me now, you can, there's all these films you can watch, but you can't watch them until you're 135. It's like, what on earth is in these movies? Right? Nothing could live up to that. But nevertheless, I found it really interesting at the time, and I still find it really interesting. It's the film I've watched more than any other in my life. Okay. I generally watch it at least once a year. And every time I find something new in it, I think the premise itself of that sort of being killed in your sleep and being stalked for reasons that you can't comprehend because it's nothing really to do with you is just endlessly fascinating to me. And I don't think I'll ever get bored of it, no matter how many times I see it. It's got its flaws as a movie. I recognise its flaws, but I love it dearly anyway. And I can't imagine any other film that I would love as dearly as that one.
It's definitely it's one I watched on video, although I lied in my memory because I was convinced I watched it at the cinema, but I just wouldn't have been old enough, so I don't believe I would. I obviously watched it on video, and my overriding memory of it is just simply when the stairs turn to marshmallow, which is a proper thing that could be in your dream. It's like just your imagination going, "Nah, you're not. You think you're going to escape? No, you're not."
Yeah. And there are so many great moments in it, so many great effects in it, and so much ingenuity in how they put it together on basically no money. But it just works on the basis of that's core idea. And it's like, I think that solidified my interest in the slasher film generally, which it's been synonymous with horror for me and always has been. But it really sort of cemented my love of horror, and I haven't stopped since. Started renting all the sequels, then started on the Friday the 13th. Whatever I could get my hands on, it was all from that one moment. And so, as a horror academic, that's the point at which my life turned.
Amazing. I don't know if you know this, but the original script was Freddy was a child molester. However, the decision was made to make him a child murderer because of a series of molestations in California at the time. And I feel like this is like an echo to a point you make in the book about adapting to ever-changing zeitgeist and readily accommodate turns in contemporaneous societal norms, whereby in 2010 he was rewritten as a child molester because it was perfectly fine then.
Yeah, although the paedophile panic was seen to be at a much greater height in 2010, so I was a bit surprised that they went there.
Yeah.
But I suppose that it was a way of evoking horror in a different way and making him darker as a character. That was the promise of the remake, even if it didn't quite work.
And then the other thing that I was able, in looking at the film before we spoke, is Freddy Krueger is the name of a schoolmate who bullied Wes Craven. Literally. Yeah. I mean, not Fred, not Bill Krueger, Fred Krueger. There we go, there's our first fan. But Fred Krueger, you're like thinking, there's revenge served best. Do you know what I mean? It's like you make him into a horror icon of ever time. I mean, Freddy Krueger's not Fred Smith, is it?
No, I know it might be that why Craven ended up being a bit pissed off that he turned into a joke, as it were, because it's like he doesn't want it to be a joke. He wants to do this nasty, horrible thing.
But I mean, from a screenwriting point of view, I'd love to know how the joy he must have found when he came up with the idea of pulling Freddy out of a dream into real. That twist in the tale, as it were, is a real brilliant moment. And obviously the hero works it out for herself, kind of thing. And it's really magic. And I'd love to have been there when they cracked that in the screenwriting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right then, sir. Second choice is a Marx Brothers movie from 1932, and is included among the American Film Institute's 2000 list of top 100 funniest American movies. When the film was being shot, this is a weird fact, a pre-famous Shirley Temple walked by the set with her parents, and Harpo Marx reportedly approached the parents and offered to adopt her on the spot for $50,000. I mean, where's that coming from? Wow. It's the story of Quincy Adams Wagstaff, Huxley University's new president, who accidentally hires bumblers Baravelli and Pinky to help his school win the big football game against their rival, Darwin University. I'm talking about the Marx Brothers magic film Horse Feathers, but it isn't really about the film, apparently, so much as what it represents for Steve and his attitude to film viewing. So tell us more.
So, yeah, it's not really like, while I really like the film, I picked it as one of the films that changed my life, as it were, because of what it represents.
Okay.
So when I was about 13 is when I first saw that film. It was when I sort of gained independence as a film viewer. I had a TV in my room and everything. And at that age, I would stay up on Friday and Saturday nights and just watch TV basically until I passed out.
Yeah.
Because I could, because I didn't have school the next day and whatever. And what at that time, Channel 4 especially and BBC 2 would show all kinds of things in the early hours of the morning, because all sorts of cheap things that they could put on. But it was really where I got my film education. So I associate that period of time with Channel 4 with Godzilla movies, with Kung Fu movies, with... I first saw my first Godard film, or Razorhead for the first time, Kieslowski's Three Colours trilogy I watched, Betty Blue, all these kind of films that I would never have chosen to watch as a 13-year-old. I saw because they were on. And it was a really magical moment in television history, I think. And I think it's a real shame that we've lost it, because now it's, you get cheap reality program 24/7.
Yeah.
But that Marx Brothers film for me, I think, was, as I remember, it was my first attempt at just staying up and watching whatever was on. And I enjoyed it in a way that there's no way as a 13-year-old I would have ever picked up a 1932 comedy and stuck it on for myself or rented it out.
Yeah.
I watched it because it was there. I really enjoyed it, and I wouldn't have expected to enjoy it on paper, but I really did. And that really changed my attitude to film. I learned so much about film during that period when I was watching all this stuff from across the world. And the way it still impacts on my life now is I just still watch as voraciously as I can from wherever I can. I have themes that I'm interested in. I'm interested in revenge plots and this kind of thing, but it doesn't matter to me where the film is from, when it's from. So I'll give it a go, and I still watch as widely as possible. And I think I put that down to that one experience with the Marx Brothers.
So are you just saying that because I think because the difference now is that you can just Google whatever you want and more or less find whatever you want to watch, whereas when you're watching linear TV, you're fed what you're given, aren't you? And you have apart from having to get through the adverts and stuff, essentially most of the content is what comes on at that time, and you can only switch over is about the only choice you've got. So I guess it's a thing of like everything available versus curated content, isn't it, in a way? Because you're right. I remember Channel 4 was the reason I saw Eraserhead. There's no way on God's green earth I'd have gone to the cinema because I'd seen Eraserhead on a poster or in the listings, but because it was the only thing that was on, I got my head blown off, in late one Friday night. And you're thinking, you're actually thinking to yourself, what am I watching? Is this really a film? And you're like 15, 16, and you're kind of like, you kind of don't know what's happening, but you can't stop because it's from the adult world, so something must be normal about this somewhere. You don't realise that there's real alchemy going on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I still, from that period as well, still love films that don't do what they're supposed to do. They don't. They clearly understand the language of cinema, but play with it in really unexpected ways. When I'm sat there just going, this isn't what films usually do. This isn't how films should behave. I really enjoy it. So, and I think that comes from that period of just seeing so many different films do so many different things. But it's about limit.
Go finish that thought.
It's about limitations again. It's like you put those restrictions in place that you only have what you're fed, and suddenly you find magic in it somewhere that you wouldn't if you're just having it curated for you. This is what I worry about things like Spotify recommends playlists, is that they recommend to what your tastes are. And, I want it to throw me some free jazz at some point and go, well, how about this? And I go, okay, great, I'll give that a go. So
Stuart Lee did a gag about this where he talks about Amazon saying, oh, you like that book? What about this book? What about this book? What about that book? And he said, maybe at one point Amazon should say, look, you're reading a lot of books. You should just go out for a walk in the woods for a bit. And it's kind of like, there's a truism to that. And I must admit, with the kind of way that Spotify's and Apple Music work, I try my damnedest to move around the music genres. I can't help myself sometimes because I listen to a lot of music while I'm working, which has a certain style and tempo to it in that. But yeah, I am conscious because it's not the same as walking in a record shop, as I can reveal myself as Father Time. And the guy in the shop go, hey, Stuart, this is like that band you like. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
So you've got like a trusted friend who's there's no magic formula. It's just you've walked in the shop, he's got it in his hand. And then he says, you'll like this. And that's kind of, or it's just on in the shop.
Yeah, my record store analogy is that I always used to go when they were still around to like the independent record shop and just go through their racks of CDs that they were selling off for £1 because no one wanted them, and going, I'll give that one a go. And I just used to come out with a stack of them. 90% of them would be terrible, but there was always the one gem. And there's some that I still listen to now that I'm like, I'm so glad I found it. Would have never have found it any other way. Magic happens.
I hit upon a formula which I can't repeat because it's not easy to follow, but I found myself loving two films that were very Marmitey. So there was The Counselor, Ridley Scott's film, and Nicholas Winding Refn's Only God Forgives.
Yeah.
Drive is a massive smash. Only God Forgives. What the fuck are you doing, Nicholas? Where it was most people's reaction, but not mine. And I went and looked at the Amazon reviews for the DVDs and the Blu-rays, And I discovered that both those films have got the same profile. Like 25% 5-star reviews, 40% 1-star reviews. It's a really interesting measure of what I might see as a good film for my tastes. It's not a model to market a film on. Hey, 25% of the audience are going to like this a lot, but most are not going to like it. But it was kind of absurd finding to see that films that I love are kind of in a real love-hate. They're the kind of things that people love-hate, which is a uncanny segue to your final choice, which is, I mean, to call it a Marmite movie would be an extreme, wouldn't it? I mean, his whole canon is a challenge in of itself, but I think he surpassed even himself with this one. For your final choice, we are going to be looking at an infamous early noughties bit of French extreme cinema, where the events over the course of one traumatic night in Paris unfold in reverse chronological order. That is what IMDb described the film as. I cannot believe that is how it's described, because that really undersells it. Ironically, the film was shot chronologically. Written and directed by Gaspar Noé, he had only a 3-page draft when he went to shoot the movie, and all the dialogue was improvised. At the film's premiere, in front of 2,400 people, this is at Cannes Film Festival, I should say, after approximately 200 walkouts during the screening and fire wardens administering oxygen to 20 people who fainted, when the credits rolled, it left the stunned audience sat in almost complete silence until the next movie started. I'm talking about 2002's Irreversible. Tell us more, Steve. Where does this fit?
Okay, so again, this is to do with me more than the film.
Yeah, sure.
So when I started my PhD thesis, it was the first time I was really engaging with film, the first time I was doing horror. Yeah. So before that, I'd done English language and literature, so I'd done a lot of Dickens and this kind of thing. I definitely didn't want to write my thesis about. And I'd always loved horror, but it was the first time that I thought, right, okay, as a thing, I've got to think about what horrifies me before I begin to start this project.
Yeah.
And then before that period, when I was an undergraduate, I'd sort of made a kind of a semi-unspoken pact with my housemates that we weren't really interested in watching anything with sexual violence in it because we found it offensive and disturbing. And for instance, we watched Showgirls a lot as a film because we liked it, and my housemate and I decided that we would wind past the rape sequence because we didn't want to watch it, didn't want to engage with it, and it kind of ruined the film for us. So when I came to my thesis, I was like, that's what horrifies me, because it's the only thing really that I'm avoiding in horror is sexual violence.
Got you.
And so I'd heard about Irreversible, and from a friend who'd said, yeah, I think it's a really, really good film, but I never want to watch the thing again. And here's why. I think you shouldn't watch it. And so I thought I'd throw myself in the deep end, and just because I knew what it was about, I knew what I was getting into. And so I sat down and watched it as a kind of confrontational thing, so I could think about what was horrifying to me about it. The thing that surprised me about it is the way I reacted to it, because I was expecting to be angry, but I wasn't. I cried, and I wasn't expecting that. And that led me to think about horror and my relationship with horror and the intersections between horror and violence and sexual violence. And then I came to engage with, because then I started to look into the literature around it, and I was engaging with the anti-porn feminist movement, which in the late 70s, early 80s were referring to horror as if it were pornography.
Yeah.
Again, the slashers featured in that discussion. And that then led me to write about pornography and its intersections with horror, and it's really shaped my academic career in a way that I wasn't anticipating. But it all kind of boils down at the heart of it to that one film, and it led me towards watching a lot of films that beyond that I'm not sure, I know for sure that I would never watch again, because there's a lot of films that I saw that I regret watching and I can't now excise them from my head. And I watched a lot of extreme horror after that, because once I had a grip on that, I sought out more and more extreme versions of the same kind of premise.
Yeah.
And so I became like the expert in that particular area, simply because it horrified me so much. And I think part of it was probably about me gaining control over my own fear, that I confronted myself with a lot of it. But that's why I've chosen that film, because it shaped my entire academic career.
And I guess as well that what Irreversible does is it, the fact that it played at Cannes Film Festival speaks to a quality which possibly isn't present in a lot of other extreme cinema. In the sense of, not every French extreme, not every film that's considered part of the French extreme of the early noughties got to play at prestigious film festivals. And that's, I think that was the bit for, I've only seen it once and I'm not sure I'll ever watch it again. But when I watched it, I was told you don't want to watch it, or because I'm, at 18 and I just watched it as a rite of passage. But when I was sort of old, I was 30 when I watched it. It's like, you're beyond rite of passage. You're kind of like, what am I watching for? But actually I was stunned by what an amazing film it was. And then when it gets to the notorious sequence, it blows your mind, like the way it's done. Like you've never seen it done that. You've never seen a rape sequence film that way. Weirdly, the closest is in terms of that unflinching eye, which is what he does so effectively, is I Spit on Your Grave, the original one of that one, if you'd seen that one.
Yeah. So the time that when I saw Irreversible, I hadn't seen I Spit on Your Grave. That's something I encountered afterwards. But yeah, I think the thing that I agree with you, like it's an extremely Irreversible is an extremely well made film, and I think it's a shame for all the people who walked out of it that they didn't get to see the lovely bit at the end,
the denouement of where it goes.
It becomes nice and then it becomes tragic, and and I watched it shortly after that. I watched Innocence, and it felt like a real pairing with it, because it's like Innocence is all very lovely and it's very sort of Kodak green instead of that sort of the redness of Irreversible. And there's this darkness underneath that it doesn't really show, which is the opposite of what Irreversible was doing. So as a double pairing, it's really disturbing, but works really well.
Now, this is a question I ask film distributors, film festival programmers, which is watching a film for a job and watching the film as a fan. So how do you separate the two, as it were? And can you even, where you're at now in your sort of knee deep in films and writing these kind of text about films?
It is. I think it probably is pretty impossible for me to separate out the two. I think I've probably used the kind of professionalism as a way of either finding value in some films that I probably wouldn't as a fan, or maybe coming to terms with some films like Irreversible that I wouldn't have enjoyed necessarily as a fan. I'd have liked it as a piece of cinema, but I wouldn't watch it again as a kind of just a lay film viewer, whereas I've seen it several times because that's professionally I've seen it more times than I otherwise would have done. But I've got a kind of a reason to be watching it that that fuels and motivates me to watch it in a different way. So the two are inseparable. But I think it gives me a good reason to find value in films that I wouldn't otherwise find. My general attitude is, if I go into watching something and I can't find some value in it intellectually or as a fan, then I've failed. The film hasn't failed, I've failed. And it often happens to me, but nevertheless, that's my general approach, is that someone has made this for a reason. If I can't get on terms with it, it's not for me, but then I failed in some way and I should try and find my way into it.
I used to write reviews for Fright Fest for Britflic's website. I used to do like the whole 5 days, and when I'd watch a film and I'd have a knee-jerk reaction maybe, and then I'd try and write why I'd had such a knee-jerk reaction, and I mean that in a negative sense. And quite often, once I began to wrestle with what was making me have that knee-jerk response, I ended up admiring the film more.
Yeah. No, that's why I think that I certainly found that with a lot of the sort of more extreme films that I was watching, is that it clearly did something to me. If it disturbed me or upset me, then it's good in what it's trying to do. What I objected to was a lot of films that I saw that were trying to be shocking, trying their best to be shocking, but not really getting there because they were trying too hard.
Yeah,
you see, and it just feels like, oh, that's what you're doing, and it's. Sure, it's it might have that effect on some people, but no.
Yeah, because I mean, thinking of extreme cinema, it's like I don't get the appeal of, say, the August Underground stuff, but on the other hand, watching something like Grotesque, the Japanese film, I could, even though the thing appalled me, there was something about it which was much more interesting than what the August Underground was. I don't know whether that's my subjective opinion or the quality of the films, but there was definitely something I could see that was different between the two, even though on the surface to most people, it just is napalm death of film. It's like, it's not for the faint-hearted.
I mean, I've got a lot of time actually for the August Underground films that I've spent a lot of time with them. But this is the thing about extreme cinema, is like people often ask me, like, you do extreme cinema, what's the most disturbing film you've ever seen? And I won't say, because firstly, because everyone's trigger points are different. Yeah. So what one person finds disturbing, another person won't. One person finds valuable, another person won't. But also because there are some films, as I say, I regret seeing, and I don't really want to lead people towards it as a kind of, if you say to someone, this is the most disturbing film I've ever seen, their natural curiosity might lead them towards it. And there are some images that I just don't want in my brain. So why would I do it to someone else?
Exactly. And if you were to look at it in any way, shape, objectively, then as from the little research I've done, Ghost Watch has had the biggest impact on people, because there are people with PTSD haven't seen it. And there's cases of that happening. And the switchboard lit up at the BBC when they broadcast it. There's all kinds of measures of what's extreme, or even like people that saw Watership Down as a kid. It really isn't as simple as that's a horrible thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And thank you for sharing those thoughts about and insights into the Metamodern Slasher Film, your new book. And it just gives me to say thank you very much and give you time on the Britflic's podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hey there, it's Hugh from Podderation here. If you like today's show, why not have a listen to The Ramble? Ridiculous, irreverent, and sometimes maybe just a little bit raunchy. The Ramble is what you get when you put two professionally funny people in a room together and give them license to talk about anything they want underneath the umbrella of nerdy hobbies. We think you'll love it, and if you want to check it out, go to our website at podderation.com.